Transnistria and Abkhazia, two breakaway republics which have long been controlled by Russia, are both still in serious trouble. The trouble they're in has changed since I first made a video on this topic a few months ago. Both countries have avoided a total collapse, but in lots of ways, the trouble that they're in now is much worse. Abkhazia completed its presidential elections in March, and the pro-Kremlin candidate won, amid widespread accusations of fraud, of course. Russia rewarded the Abkhaz people by lifting the crippling economic sanctions which they had enacted, but Russia has pressed ahead with its total takeover of the country. As part of this, Russia has designated independent Abkhaz journalists as, quote, foreign agents, which doesn't really make any sense. They're Abkhaz citizens living in Abkhazia. They don't have anything to do directly with Russia. But I guess when you're a colonial power, you don't really have to make a lot of sense to do what you want to do. Transnistria has been saved from an utterly dire energy crisis, which was an existential threat to the continued existence of the country, at least for now. But the Transnistrian economy is still crippled. Transnistria is now totally dependent on the goodwill of Moldova, and in order to raise money, the Transnistrian government seems to be engaged in fraud against its own citizens. So, yeah, things are not going very well in either of these pseudo-states. Let's get into it. Hi everyone, I'm Fredo Rockwell, and I've long been interested in Transnistria and Abkhazia, these two pseudo-states. And earlier this year, I made a video about two crises which were unfolding in these two places at the same time. I'll provide a short summary of each crisis as we go, but if you want more detail, go ahead and check out that earlier video. Let's start with Transnistria. Transnistria broke away from Moldova in the early 90s, at roughly the same time that Moldova broke away from the Soviet Union. It maintained its quasi-independence with economic and military support from Russia. And for decades, the entire country has been powered by Russian gas, which has been coming through a pipeline that crosses through Ukraine. That pipeline was shut off on January 1st of this year, and almost immediately Transnistria declared a state of emergency, and then pretty much the entire country started to fall apart. Factories shut down, schools were closed, and homes had little or no heat in the middle of winter. People cut firewood to survive, but predictably, some people did not survive. When we last left things, Transnistria was facing a cliff edge. Even with gas rationed to absolute minimum levels, they were going to run out of gas completely by the end of January. Geographically cut off from Russia, Transnistria was facing a humanitarian crisis. Here's what happened next. Things were so serious that the European Union stepped in with a €20 million grant for Transnistria. This was enough money for them to buy gas to supply the country with power for 2 weeks. The EU did this not because they're supporters of the Transnistrian government. They just didn't want thousands of people to freeze to death. The EU then offered a further €60 million, but with some strings attached, and the Transnistrian government turned them down. And that was a bold move. Transnistria is landlocked, and it only borders two countries, Ukraine and Moldova, both countries which are more or less aligned with the EU and are hostile to the Transnistrian government. So, on the surface, things looked really dire. But then, on the 16th of February, what was effectively the very last moment, Russia was able to start supplying Transnistria with gas again, thanks to help from a company from Hungary. Actually, that company, MET Gas and Marketing, is actually based in Switzerland, but it was founded in Hungary by a Hungarian citizen who runs it still today. And I guess this isn't totally surprising. As I'm sure many of you watching this know, Hungary is the one member of the EU which has been the most supportive of Russia for the past few years. Now, the exact terms of this deal between Russia, MET, and Transnistria are not very clear. The information on MET's website is kind of hazy and doesn't really quite add up to me. I'm not saying there's anything untoward here. They're a private company just being private with the details of their commercial operations, which is their right. Looking through the available sources I've been able to find, here's what I've pieced together. Gazprom, the state-owned energy company, is supplying Transnistria with 3 million cubic meters of gas per day. This is being transported by MET up to the Moldovan border, and then the Moldovan energy company, Moldovgas, pumps it into Transnistria. I'm not sure how long this deal is meant to last. One place on MET's website refers to it lasting a few days, another place a short time, but then in an interview that the CEO gave with his own website, he talked with great pride about this deal, and this was over a month after it started, so it kind of looks like it's in place, at least for the medium term. Now, 3 million cubic meters of gas per day might sound like a lot to you. It does to me, but it turns out it's not really very much when it comes to powering a small country. It's enough to start heating homes again, to reopen schools, and to start essential services like food processing, but it's not enough for Transnistria's relatively large industrial base to restart all of their factories. From what I've read, this is on purpose. The Transnistrian state has long relied on the taxes generated by its relatively large industrial base. And Moldova doesn't want Transnistria to have enough power to restart these factories and get their economy fully going again. They want the Transnistrian government to remain hobbled. And I know that sounds kind of harsh, but remember, Transnistria is effectively a renegade regime inside Moldova. So with factories mostly shut, and the Transnistrian government not collecting taxes from that, you got to ask, is the Transnistrian government going to go bankrupt? Have they run out of cash? No. And it appears the way that they've done this is with a sort of shell game, defrauding the citizens of Transnistria. Let me explain. On the 1st of March, the Transnistrian government announced a price increase on energy to 1.15 Transnistrian rubles per cubic meter of gas. That's about $0.1 per cubic meter, or 10 cents, which is not very much. Here in the UK, I pay about 10 times that much for a cubic meter of gas. But anyway, the Transnistrian government justified this price increase, saying that now they have to transport gas across more borders, and that this costs more for some reason, and also that they're borrowing money in order to pay for this gas, and so they've got to repay that. So they need the price increase, guys, so that they can, pay for this emergency loan or whatever they're saying they've taken. That doesn't really seem to be the case at all. According to the Moldovan newspaper Ziarul de Garda, which is a newspaper that focuses on corruption and human rights abuses, Gazprom is giving Transnistria this gas for free. They're not paying anything for it. So if we assume for a moment that the money being generated through utility bills is pure profit, it's probably not all pure profit, but let's just say it is, that's around $300,000 per day that the Transnistrian government is raking in from its citizens who think they're paying for their utility bills. $300,000 is not a huge amount of money, but it's been enough for the Transnistrian government to keep the lights on, quite literally. And as a result of this, the Transnistrian government announced that they were able to pay government salaries and old age pensions on time at the end of March. Just the fact that this was worth mentioning in the media makes it seem to me like it was in some doubt. So I guess, well done, Transnistrian government. You paid your debts. How much is a Transnistrian pension? You might want to know. It's 800 Transnistrian rubles, or about $50 per month. That's $600 per year. The upshot of this is, with a good amount of effort, Russia has been able to help Transnistria just enough so that it can limp on, which I think is enough for Russia. Transnistria's devotion to the Kremlin and to Putin has been absolute for decades now, but I've always had the feeling that it doesn't run the other way, and that Putin and the Kremlin don't really care about Transnistria that much and really only pay attention to it when they need something or when they have to. A good example of this is Russia has never formally recognized Transnistria as an independent state. It's done this for all of the other sort of puppet regimes that it's supported around the world, but never Transnistria. I think if a humanitarian crisis had unfolded in Transnistria, that would have drawn the world's attention to the situation and probably embarrassed Russia and made them look weak, and they didn't want that. So they did enough to stave off an absolute disaster. But once they sort of reached that threshold, they lost interest. That's what I think. The other scenario is that Russia lacked the ability or the power to actually fix a situation. Either way, it's not really to Russia's credit. The long-term future for Transnistria now looks pretty bleak. If they can't restart their factories, eventually the working population of Transnistria is going to want to leave. And because virtually everyone in Transnistria is eligible for a Moldovan passport, it's pretty easy for them to leave. And once your working age population leaves the country, it's just a matter of time before even paying those $50 a month pensions becomes impossible. Unless there's a dramatic change to the circumstances of Transnistria, I think it's headed either for a slow motion collapse or to become more and more dependent on the EU and Moldova over time, which would undermine its claimed sovereignty. I don't think there's much chance of a dramatic change at the moment. They've just declared another extension to the state of emergency. It's the third or fourth one. I've sort of lost count. But yeah, they've extended it to the 8th of June. One other bit of Transnistria news before we switch topics. On the 10th of April, President Krasnolevsky of Transnistria called President Gumba of Abkhazia to congratulate him on his election the previous month. For me, this was like when two characters I know from different TV shows sort of team up in a crossover episode. So that's pretty cool. It's like geopolitical fan service. All right, Abkhazia. Let's check out what's been happening there. So as I just referred to, Badra Gumba, the Kremlin's choice, was indeed elected president of Abkhazia on the 1st of March. This wasn't really a surprise for anyone, but this election wasn't the sort of foregone conclusion that you see in Russia or Belarus. Abkhazia's previous president, Aslan Bajania, resigned in November in the face of mass public protest over a proposed law that would increase Russia's control over Abkhazia. When new presidential elections were called, Adgur Ajimba, one of the leaders of those protests, put himself forward as the main opposition candidate to run against Gumba, who had been vice president under Bajania. So in broad terms, this was an election between an upstart opposition leader who wanted a more independent Abkhazia and a member of the ruling elite who wanted to draw closer to Russia and let Russia have more control over the country. You can probably guess who Vladimir Putin wanted to win. The first round of voting took place on the 15th of February. There were 3 other candidates on the ballot and nobody got over 50% of the vote. So Arjimba and Gumba faced each other in a runoff election on the 1st of March. Gumba won, but just with 55% of the vote. Compared to what you see in Russia, this was an incredibly tight election. When Vladimir Putin ran for re-election as president in 2024, he won an implausible 88% of the vote. So in lots of ways, this election appeared to be a lot more competitive than what you might see in Russia. And I think it's fair to say that there was at least a possibility that either candidate would win. I mean, it was heavily influenced and there was a lot of stuff going on to make sure that Gumba won, but it wasn't like 100% in the bag from the beginning. At least that was my impression. Here are some of the dubious events which took place. Just to be clear, my sources here are the Abkhaz independent media. I'm not getting this from Georgian, American, or European sources. Throughout both rounds of voting, Arjimba was accused of being a, quote, Turkish agent. The insinuation was that if he was elected, he would take orders from the Turkish government and start to persecute the Armenians who live in Abkhazia. There are about 40,000 Armenians in Abkhazia. That's 20% of the population, so it is a significant voting bloc. This smear campaign was based on really flimsy evidence. Arjimba, when he went to high school, went to Basharan College, which is a college founded by a Turkish entrepreneur and philanthropist and is part of the Gulen movement, which is a sort of Turkish political, religious, educational movement, which has schools all around the world. You might have heard of this. In 2016, President Erdogan of Turkey accused the Gulen movement of attempting a coup to overthrow him, and then started arresting Gulen movement members and throwing them in jail. And it was a huge scandal. Anyway, these are the enemies of Erdogan. So the idea that because decades ago, Arjimba went to this school, which had been founded by someone in this movement, that he would take orders from Erdogan to start persecuting Armenians, it didn't make any sense. It was absolutely absurd. Other dirty tricks included illegal pulling of Abkhaz citizens from Russia, something that Abkhazian law doesn't allow. Visits by Russian ministers to see Gumba in public, another thing that election law doesn't allow. And this one he was actually picked up on and scolded by the Central Election Commission. And after many years of neglect, several prominent streets in Sukhumi, the Abkhaz capital, suddenly started getting repaired and repaved, something which had been a huge problem for decades, but suddenly happened right before the election. All of this was on top of the enormous unofficial economic sanctions, which were placed on Abkhazia by Russia right after President Bajania was forced out of office. The most prominent of these were restrictions on Abkhazian agricultural products, enforced by Russian border guards after inspectors claimed to find an insect called the Californian thrip in Abkhaz produce. An Abkhaz youth movement known as Kara Kabit Sunda. I'm really sorry, I don't know how to pronounce Abkhaz. I don't know how to pronounce a lot of things. I'm sure I mangled that. I'm sorry. Anyway, they had a statement which came out after the election about the corruption, which I'm going to read selections from. If you want to read the whole thing, it's very interesting. There's a link in the pinned comment. The 2025 elections confidently entered the annals of our history as the dirtiest elections in modern Abkhazia. 3 open ballot boxes, 2 polling stations with shooting, missing ballots, enough to stop the elections. But despite all the pressure, all the disinformation, pre-election performances, tours, manipulations, despite the use of administrative resources and the deliberate creation of an ethnic rift, that's referring to the Armenians, they were unable to gain a strong lead, they being Gumba's campaign. Of the 98,727 votes counted, 43,773 yesterday expressed disagreement with the policy of Gumba's campaign. And then addressing Gumba, they say, bought votes will never be expressed in real support. Those who came here by March 1st and left immediately after will not stand in the square with you. Legitimacy is a key factor for the Abkhaz leader, and here it simply does not exist. And this will come back to haunt them. A painted victory will not give power, no matter how many security forces are hired per day. And 43,000 people will not go anywhere. This is one of several similar statements I saw come out after the election, but I thought this one was especially powerful. And that idea that the people who voted against Gumba are still there. Those are the ones who are going to stand in the square the next time that there is a controversy. It seems really clear to me that with all of Russia's pressure and dirty tricks and tactics that they engaged in, that they really didn't get that many votes when you consider. And so it's really possible that actually a majority of people in Abkhazia do not support Gumba, that in lots of ways his victory was illegitimate. And that means that the political crisis, which started in November, which this election was supposed to fix, has not been fixed. There is still a crisis of legitimacy. And it seems likely that when the next sort of event happens, which kicks up controversy, there'll be more public protests and more instability in Abkhazia. If Abkhazia was a normal country, they could pursue economic development through trade, working with their neighbors. But because they're an unrecognized country, the only country that they have to work with is Russia. And Russia, rather than developing Abkhazia in a sort of mutually beneficial way, seems mostly interested in taking the country over completely. In fact, I'd say this election is a watershed moment. What we're seeing is the transformation of Abkhazia from a client state, or maybe even you could say a puppet state, into something more like a colony. Unlike Transnistria, which Russia only pays attention to sporadically when they need something or when they have to, Russia wants things from Abkhazia. They want their coastline to build naval bases now that they've been chased out of Crimea. They want their produce. They want their holiday homes. They don't want any trouble on their border. So it looks like they just want to take over. They've not yet eliminated all resistance in Abkhazia, but they're working on it. And if you want an example of the Kremlin eliminating resistance in Abkhazia, you need look no further than what they're doing to Abkhazia's independent media. About a week after the presidential election, the Russian Ministry of Justice declared an Abkhaz journalist named Inal Khashig a, quote, foreign agent. Russia's Ministry of Justice declares people foreign agents all the time. That's not weird. You may remember Ekaterina Duntsova, the woman who last year almost successfully registered as a candidate for president to run against Putin, and who had the support of thousands of ordinary Russians across the country. She was declared a foreign agent as part of her punishment for having the audacity to run as a popular candidate, actually to try and defeat Putin. As a foreign agent, every single social media post Duntsova now makes has to be preceded by a very long, very weird warning that she is not someone good Russians should listen to. But Duntsova is a Russian citizen living in Russia. Khashig is an Abkhazian citizen living in Abkhazia. He's not even one of the tens of thousands of Abkhaz who have dual citizenship, who have Abkhaz and Russian citizenship. He's only an Abkhaz citizen. And yes, the newspaper, which he founded, Chemenskaya Pravda, does talk about politics, but only Abkhaz politics. Reacting to the news of his status as a foreign agent, Khashoggi said, "Honestly, I don't even know how to react. My writings have always been focused exclusively on Abkhazian topics." And he also said, "I gather that speaking about Abkhazia's sovereignty has now become criminalized." Khashoggi, it turns out, was only the first journalist to be targeted by Russia's Justice Ministry. Izida Chania, founder of newspaper Nuzhna Gazeta, and Nizva Arshpa, editor of the Abkhaz news agency Aishara, were also both declared foreign agents on the 21st of March. I don't expect you to know who either of these people are, but Arshpa's Telegram channel is one that I have been using as a source for this video and the original video I made. I actually tried to contact her and I asked her if I could interview her. She didn't respond, but I did notice that one of the justifications I saw for her being named as a foreign agent is her talking to foreigners. So I'm kind of glad I didn't talk to her because I don't want that on my conscience. Reacting to the news, she said, "I am not a Russian citizen and I never have been. Abkhazia is not Russia." On the surface, these moves by the Russian Justice Ministry make no sense. But remember, thousands of Abkhaz have Russian passports as well, so it does actually have leverage over a large part of Abkhaz society. Having a Russian passport is really important for a lot of Abkhaz people. Their own passports aren't recognized by much of the world, and having a Russian passport allows them to travel and do business in Russia. So since Abkhazia is very small and very dependent on Russia for all of its economic activity, having that Russian passport taken away could be really detrimental to someone's business or livelihood. And in fact, during the campaign in late January, 2 opposition MPs in Abkhazia, who also were Russian citizens, had their Russian citizenship stripped from them. People who are not dual citizens can't be threatened in this way, of course, but I think that's what they're doing by declaring these independent journalists as foreign agents. It's kind of a signal to the people who do have Russian passports saying, these are people you need to steer clear of, or else. One possible casualty of all this Russian interference in the Abkhaz media is the website Abkhaz World. It's an English language independent Abkhaz website, which has been another one of my main sources. They've been publishing articles for several years, every few days. It's been a good source of information. It's very pro-Abkhaz independence, but it's not pro-Russian. But it mysteriously stopped on the 25th of March. That was their last article about 6 weeks ago. Let me tie up a couple other plot threads before we finish off. Remember those dangerous Californian thrips that Russian agricultural inspectors found in Abkhaz produce and caused Russia to block all Abkhaz produce from coming into Russia for months? Well, a couple days after Gumba was elected, those thrips seem to have suddenly disappeared, and exports to Russia have resumed. So that's good news. Next, remember Adgur Kharazia? He's the MP who in December pulled out a pistol during a debate in Parliament and started shooting and killed one MP and wounded another. Anyway, Kharazia fled the scene from Parliament and has not been seen since. And although there was a great deal of noise in the Abkhaz media and government circles about trying to capture him, there's been no media coverage of his case since at least January. I guess he's still at large somewhere. But yeah, that's been pretty wild that's just sort of disappeared and no one's talking about it. And lastly, on the 20th of April, opposition leader Adgar Arjimba was detained by Russian border forces for several hours. It didn't last that long and there wasn't a reason given, but it's pretty clear it was sent as a signal and to intimidate Arjimba and Abkhaz opposition figures. And it's just one more step in which you can see Russia interfering in Abkhazia and trying to take over. Just to be clear, I don't support Abkhazia's independence. I think it's rightfully part of Georgia and ideally should return to Georgian control. I just don't think it's in anybody's interests, Georgia's interests or the Abkhaz people's interests, for Russia to totally take over the country. But that seems to be where we're headed. Looking for a moment at the broader view, what can we tell about Russia from these events in Abkhazia and Transnistria? Even though both of these crises are less acute than they were a few months ago, they're not really fixed. Russia has done just enough to kind of keep Transnistria from totally collapsing. It hasn't done more either because it can't or it doesn't really care enough to. Abkhazia is facing several crises, including an energy crisis of its own, but its biggest problem is increasingly Russia itself. Russia used to pretend, at least, that Abkhazia was an independent sovereign state and went to great efforts to try and force other countries to recognize Abkhazia as an independent sovereign state. But now it seems to be giving up on pretending, and it's just treating Abkhazia like a full-blown colony. And there's nothing Abkhazia can really do about this. Thanks for watching. Before I go, some of my older videos became quite unexpectedly popular during April and got lots and lots of views, and I've had a lot of new subscribers. So if you're new to the channel, thank you. I found it slightly embarrassing that one of those videos, it was like my third ever video and made in PowerPoint, but it was great to see that people enjoyed it. But yeah, thank you very much. Please feel free to join me on my Discord server if you want to come and say hello. I try to remain active there. And yeah, thank you very much. And I'll see you guys in the next video.